The morning of the auction, there were 800 chicks nobody wanted. They sat in the corner of the sale barn in a stack of cardboard flats, most of them wheezing, some of them with their eyes crusted half shut, and every one of them marked down to almost nothing, because the man who had ordered them had taken one look when the truck arrived and refused delivery. The county's bird buyers filed past those flats the way people file past a wreck on the highway, slowing to look, then speeding up so they would not be caught looking. A few of the chicks had died in the night. The rest peeped in that thin, ragged way that sick birds do, a sound that carries a kind of apology in it, as if they knew they were the reason no bid came. And when the auctioneer got to them near the end of the morning, he did not even bother with his sing-song. He just said, "Folks, we got these here respiratory birds. Open and bid whatever you got in your pocket." And the men laughed because in Halden County, a laugh was cheaper than a bid. That was when Della Rourke, 23 years old, standing at the back in her grandmother's canvas coat with a spiral notebook rolled up in one fist, raised her hand and said, $40. The barn went quiet the way a room goes quiet when somebody says something that cannot be unsaid. Then Cal Werner, who ran the biggest broiler operation on the North End and had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a verdict, turned around on his heel and looked at her and said loud enough for the whole barn, "Honey, you just bought yourself 800 funerals." And the men laughed again, harder this time. And Della did not laugh and did not blush and did not explain. She only walked down to the front, counted 2 20s out of the coat pocket, and knelt down beside the flats to look at those birds the way a person looks at something she is deciding to be responsible for. Before we go any further into this, do me one small favor. If you have ever had somebody tell you that the thing you were holding on to wasn't worth the trouble, tap that like button so more folks who need this story can find it, and drop a comment telling me the town or the city you're watching from right now, because I read them, every single one, and I like knowing where these stories land. Go ahead and do that. Now let's begin. Della had not planned on any of it. That is the part people got wrong later, when they tried to make her into somebody with a scheme. She had not come home to Halden County with a business plan folded in her pocket. She had come home because there was nowhere else that felt like it would hold her, and because her grandmother's place had gone quiet in a way that needed answering. Her mother had left the county at 19 and never fully returned, and Della had grown up in 3 different rented apartments in 3 different towns, none of which had a yard, all of which had thin walls. The one steady thing in her childhood had been the summers, 2 weeks or sometimes a month, spent out on the ridge with her grandmother Ada, an old woman who wore men's work boots without a shred of self-consciousness because she had earned the right, who spoke maybe 40 words on a talkative day, and who kept chickens the way other people kept religion. Those summers were where Della learned that you could stand still and watch an animal for 10 full minutes and come away knowing something you could not have been told. When Ada's health began its slow settling, the way an old barn settles beam by beam, without collapsing, Della was the one who came. She was the only one who came. She moved into the back bedroom that still smelled of cedar and liniment, and she found herself keeping the fires and feeding the last few hens and driving Ada to the clinic in Marisburg every 3rd Thursday. And in the long silences of that house she began to understand that the place had once been more than it was now. There had been a laying operation here decades back in her grandfather Emmett's day, a modest but respected concern that sold eggs to 3 counties and hatched its own replacements from a strain the Rourkes had bred and kept and refined for the better part of 40 years. Now there was only the leaning coop, the empty brooder house with its cold hovers, and the memory of a name that the older feed store men still said with a small nod when they realized whose granddaughter she was. The place had potential the way dormant ground has potential, which is to say invisibly, and only to a person willing to wait. Della was that kind of person, though she did not know it about herself yet. What she knew was that the mortgage on the property had been paid off 2 generations back, that the taxes were small, that she had $11,000 saved from 4 years of restaurant work and community college classes she had never finished, and that she did not, at present, have any better idea than to stay. She kept a notebook because Ada kept a notebook, and because writing a thing down was how you made yourself look at it twice. In those first weeks she wrote down the weather, the number of eggs, the behavior of the 4 remaining hens, and the things her grandmother said, which were few, and which she was beginning to suspect were worth more than they sounded. It was Ada who set the whole thing in motion, though she did it the way she did everything, without ceremony and without any apparent awareness of doing it. One evening in early March, with the 2 of them sitting on the porch watching the light go blue over the far pasture, Della had mentioned that she'd driven past the sale barn and seen a flyer for the Saturday poultry auction. And Ada had made a sound in her throat that was neither approval nor its opposite. Then, a long minute later, out of the silence, the old woman said, "Your grandfather never bought the pretty ones." Della waited. Ada let the pause stretch until it was almost gone, and then she added, "Said the pretty ones were bred for the eye. Said the ones nobody wanted were the ones that had been left to make it on their own. That was the whole of it." She did not explain what she meant, and Della did not ask, because asking Ada to explain was a way of ensuring she would say nothing more. But Della wrote the sentences down that night, all of them, and she underlined the last one, and something in her had begun, without her permission, to turn it over. She had not gone to the auction meaning to buy anything. She had gone to look, the way she looked at everything, patiently and without a plan, to see what the county's poultry world was made of. And what she saw mostly was men buying the birds that looked good, the plump, straight-run cockerels and the bright pullets from the commercial hatcheries, the ones bred, as Ada would have put it, for the eye. And then she saw the 800 in the corner, the rejected order, the ones marked down to nothing because a man named Cal Werner had refused them at the dock when he saw them wheezing. And something Ada had said folded itself over something else Ada had said, and Della Rourke raised her hand. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. What she did, that first afternoon, was more work than she had done in months. She loaded the flats into the bed of her grandmother's truck, a 1988 Ford that turned over on the 4th try and idled like it was composing its own obituary, and she drove them up the ridge road slow so the wind would not chill them further. She had spent the drive home doing arithmetic that most people would have called delusional. Of the 800, she guessed she would lose 200 no matter what she did. If she could bring even half of the rest through, she'd have 200 laying hens by autumn from a $40 investment, which was either the smartest thing anyone in the county had done that year or the dumbest, and she genuinely did not know which, and the not knowing did not frighten her the way it would have frightened someone else. What she felt mostly was interest. She wanted to see what would happen. She wanted to see if the ones nobody wanted could be made to make it, the way her grandfather had said they could, the way the Rourke birds always had. When she carried the first flat into the brooder house that evening, Ada was standing in the doorway in her work boots, having walked out from the house without anyone helping her, which she was not supposed to do. The old woman looked at the sick chicks for a long time. She did not smile. She reached down with one knotted hand and lifted a single chick and turned it over and looked at its vent and its eyes and set it back down. And then she said the thing that Della would remember for the rest of her life, the thing she would come back to in the hard middle of the winter to come. Ada looked at those 800 wheezing, crusted, dying, unwanted birds, and she said quietly, as if confirming a suspicion she had held for years, "Those are the ones." And she turned and walked back to the house, and she did not explain, and Della stood alone in the brooder house with 800 reasons to be laughed at, and began. The first thing she had to do was keep them from dying. And the second thing she had to do was understand why they were sick, because Ada's words had planted a suspicion in her that the sickness itself might be part of the point. She spent the first 3 nights in the brooder house on a cot she dragged out from the shed, waking every 2 hours to check the heat lamps and the water. She had read, in the weeks of caring for Ada, everything she could find about poultry respiratory disease, and she had learned that most of it in commercial birds was one of a handful of things, some viral, some bacterial, some just the crowd and stress of a hatchery shipment gone wrong. She cleaned the waterers 3 times a day. She added a little cider vinegar, and later, on the advice of the old veterinarian in Marisburg who remembered her grandfather, a course of medicated feed for the coccidiosis she found in a few of the droppings. She kept the brooder warmer than the book said and drier than the book said, because Ada, when Della described the ammonia smell rising off the litter, had said only, "Wet kills them faster than cold," which turned out to be truer than anything in the books. By the end of the first week, she had lost 140 birds. She dug the pit herself at the edge of the far pasture, and she wrote the number in the notebook without commentary, and she did not let herself grieve because grieving would have meant she had named them, and she had held that line. By the end of the second week, the losses had slowed to 2 or 3 a day. By the end of the third week, the survivors were eaten like they meant it, and the crusting had cleared from most of the eyes, and the wheeze had faded from all but the weakest. And Della stood in the doorway of the brooder house one gray morning and watched 600 and some birds scratch and squabble and dust themselves in the litter, and she understood that she had done the impossible thing, or at least the improbable thing, and that no one in the county knew or would have believed it if she told them. She did not tell them. That was not modesty. It was that she had begun to understand something she could not yet put into words, something that had to do with Ada's suspicion and her grandfather's saying, and the reason those birds had been sick in the first place. She went looking, in the last week of March, for the records. Ada had mentioned once in passing that Emmett had kept books, real books, ledgers going back to the 40s, and that they were somewhere in the house, and Della found them at last in a cedar trunk in the attic under a folded quilt. 6 leather ledgers gone soft with age, filled with a small slanted hand that recorded every hatch, every cull, every laying record, every sale, and every note on the birds themselves for 4 decades. She sat on the attic floor with a flashlight and read until her legs went numb. What she found there rearranged everything. Her grandfather had not simply kept chickens. He had bred them, deliberately and stubbornly, for one quality above all others, and that quality was not size and not egg color and not feathering. It was survival. Emmett Rourke had believed and had written it down more than once in that small slanted hand that the commercial strains being pushed on farmers by the big hatcheries were being bred soft, bred for the eye and for the crate and for the fastest possible weight, and bred, in the process, out of their own toughness. He had watched over decades as the hardy old barnyard birds that could forage and resist disease and mother their own chicks were replaced by pretty production birds that fell over dead the first hard winter or the first time something went through the flock. And so Emmett had done a thing that his neighbors thought was backward. He had selected, generation after generation, for the birds that got sick and lived. He wrote it plainly on a page dated 1961. The bird that survives the sickness carries the answer in her blood. Breed her. Cull the rest. It takes 40 years, and it cannot be bought. Della read that line 4 times. Then she went downstairs, where Ada was sitting by the window, and she said, "He bred them to survive." And Ada, without turning from the window, said, "Everybody laughed at him, too." And that was when Della understood that she had not made an impulsive bid at a sale barn at all. She had, without knowing it, walked into the middle of a story that started before she was born and picked up a thread her grandfather had spent his life spinning, and that the 800 sick, unwanted, marked-down birds in her brooder house were not a gamble. They were a test. The ones that survived it were precisely the ones her grandfather would have wanted, filtered by the very sickness that had made every other buyer walk away. Cal Werner had refused them because they were sick. The sickness was the point. The thing that made them worthless was the thing that made them priceless, if you knew how to read it. And Emmett Rourke had spent 40 years learning how to read it and had written it down and had waited in the pages of a ledger in a cedar trunk for someone patient enough to come find him. Spring came on the ridge the way it always did, all at once and then not at all. Warm days followed by a hard frost that killed the early blossoms and made the old-timers shake their heads. The surviving birds grew through it. By May, Della had 592 of them, feathered out and range-hardy, and she had done the thing her grandfather's ledgers told her to do, which was to keep them not in the commercial way, crowded and medicated, but on grass, moving them across the pasture in a wheeled pen. She built herself out of scrap lumber and welded wire, letting them forage and dust and take the weather, culling without sentiment the few that faltered. She wrote it all down. She was becoming, without noticing it, the kind of record keeper her grandfather had been, and the notebook she had started as a habit was turning into the 7th Rourke ledger. It was around then that she needed money, because 592 birds eat a great deal, and $11,000 minus feed and lumber and the vet was going down faster than she liked. So in the last week of May, Della drove down to the Halden County Feed and Farm, the store where the county's men gathered on Saturday mornings to drink the free coffee and talk about rain, and she asked Dwight, who had run the store for 30 years, whether he'd be interested in carrying her eggs. Except she did not have eggs yet, because the pullets weren't laying. So what she actually asked was whether he thought there'd be any market for eggs from birds raised on grass the old way, and Dwight, who was a kind man but not an imaginative one, said, "Honey, eggs is eggs, and folks around here get theirs at the Dollar General for $1.25 a dozen, and I can't see paying more for the same thing." And Cal Werner, who happened to be standing by the coffee with 2 other broiler men, laughed his verdict laugh and said, "That's the girl bought the funeral chickens." He said, "Sweetheart, I'll tell you how this ends." He said it the way a man states a fact for consideration. You'll pour money into those birds all summer. You'll get a few eggs. You'll sell them to the feed store for less than they cost you. And come fall, you'll be back at the sale barn selling what's left for stew. And you'll have learned the same lesson everybody learns, which is that there's no money in doing things the hard way. That ground never was worth the trouble, and neither's that flock. He meant it as a prediction of failure. It turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Della did not argue with him. Arguing with Cal Werner was like arguing with weather. She only looked at him for a moment. The long, silent look she gave things she was deciding about, and then she said flatly, "That's one approach." And she bought her feed, and she loaded it in the truck, and she drove home. But she had heard something in Dwight's dismissal that was more useful than any encouragement would have been. "Eggs is eggs," he'd said. "Folks get the same thing cheaper." And Della understood, driving up the ridge, that the whole problem was that word same. If her eggs were the same as the Dollar General's, she would lose, because the Dollar General would always be cheaper and faster and closer. Her eggs could not be the same. They had to be different, so different that the word cheaper stopped meaning anything, and the only way an egg could be that different was if the bird that laid it was that different. And her birds, thanks to a dead man's 40 years of stubbornness, were exactly that, built different. She said it out loud in the truck, to no one. "Built different," she repeated, and something in her settled. The first eggs came in the second week of July, small and irregular the way first eggs always are, and Della did not take them to Dwight. She took them instead to the one place in the county where the word same was an insult, which was the kitchen of a restaurant 30 miles down the valley in Marisburg called the Ridgeline, a place run by a chef named Sophia Marchetti, who had left a city career to open a farm-to-table restaurant in a town that mostly wanted a chicken fried steak, and who was, for that reason, always desperate and always broke and always looking for something real. Della had waited tables at the Ridgeline for a season 2 years back, before Ada got sick. She still had Sophia's number. She sent a text that said only, "I've got eggs from birds bred to survive. Raised on grass the old way, 5 dozen. Want to try them?" And Sophia, who understood that word survive in a way Dwight never could, texted back one word: yes. Della drove the 5 dozen down that afternoon. Sophia cracked one into a white bowl right there on the steel counter, the way chefs do, and the two of them looked at it, and even Della, who had raised the bird that laid it, was surprised. The yolk stood up tall and deep orange, the color of an autumn sundown, and the white held together in a tight ring instead of spreading thin. And Sophia said quietly, "My God." And then she said, "Where did you get these?" And Della said, "I raised them. They're the ones nobody wanted." And Sophia looked at her for a moment, the way one serious person looks at another when they recognize each other, and said, "I'll take every egg you can bring me, and I'll pay you $6 a dozen, and I'll want more than you have." Della drove home with an empty crate and $180, and the first real proof that the dead man in the cedar trunk had been right. $6 a dozen was more than 4 times what Dwight would have paid, and it was, Della understood, not payment for eggs, but payment for difference, for the tall orange yolk that told a customer without a word that this had come from a bird that lived a real life and carried real blood. She did not celebrate. She wrote the number in the ledger, and she did the arithmetic, and she saw that if her flock came into full lay, she would have, by the depth of autumn, something like 300 dozen eggs a week to sell, and that at $6 a dozen, that was a number that changed the whole shape of her year. But she also saw the limit of it. One restaurant, however desperate and however loyal, could not absorb 300 dozen eggs a week. She would need more buyers, and she did not have the first idea how to find them, and she had no money for advertising and no interest in it either, because advertising, like arguing, was a way of telling people a thing instead of showing it. And Della had come to believe, following her grandfather's ledgers, that showing was the only thing that lasted. So she did nothing to sell them beyond the one restaurant, and let the eggs sell themselves, which is exactly what they did, slowly, the way everything on the ridge happened. Sophia put a line on her menu that read, "Farm eggs from Rourke Ridge, raised on grass, bred to survive," and she served them soft poached over things. And the people who ate them in the little dining room in Marisburg tasted the difference the way you cannot untaste a thing. And they began to ask where they could buy them for themselves. And Sophia, who was generous in the way that broke people often are, gave them Della's number instead of keeping it to herself. By the end of August, Della had a dozen private customers driving up the Ridge Road on Saturday mornings to buy eggs off her porch, and by the middle of September she had 30, and she had raised her porch price to $7 a dozen and lost not a single customer, and the 1988 Ford had started making a new sound that she chose to ignore, and Ada sat in the window and watched the cars come up the road and said nothing. But Della noticed that the old woman had begun to put her hair up in the mornings, which she had not done in a year. The word moved the way words move in a county, from the porch to the church to the gas station counter, where a woman named Ruthie ran the register and knew everything before it happened. Ruthie tried the eggs and told everyone who bought gas that the Rourke girl up on the ridge had eggs like you couldn't believe, real ones, like your grandmother used to have. And that was the phrase that did the most work of all, like your grandmother used to have, because it turned out that half the county was hungry for exactly that and had not known there was anywhere to get it. By October, Della was selling out every egg her flock could produce and turning customers away. And she had started a list in the back of the notebook, a waiting list. And the fact of a waiting list for eggs in Halden County was a thing that people talked about at the feed store with a kind of disbelief. Cal Werner heard about it there, standing by the coffee, and he did not laugh this time. He said to Dwight that it wouldn't last, that novelty always fades, that come January when the birds stopped laying in the cold, the girl would learn what commercial lighting and controlled houses were for, and that a flock of range birds in a real Halden winter was a flock of dead birds. And Dwight, who had by then begun to feel a little ashamed of the eggs as eggs line, said only, Maybe so, Cal, maybe so. It was another prediction of failure. It went the way the first one had gone. Because winter came, hard and early that year, a wet, cold November that turned to a brutal December, and Della's birds did not die. They slowed their laying, as all birds do, but they did not die, and they did not sicken. And they came through the deep cold on the grass, and the good feed and the dry, deep litter in the old brooder house, the way her grandfather's birds had always come through it. Because they were, every one of them, the descendants in spirit and in the case of the survivors, in fact, of 40 years of breeding for exactly this, for the January that killed soft birds. Della kept a lamp on them for warmth, but not for light, refusing the trick of forcing them to lay against their nature. And she took the reduced winter eggs to Sophia and to her porch customers and told them plainly, "There'll be fewer till spring. That's how real birds work." And not one of them complained, because by then they understood that they were not buying eggs. They were buying the difference, and the difference was the whole point, and the scarcity only proved it. It was in that hard January, on a Thursday when she'd driven Ada to the clinic in Marisburg, that Della learned her grandmother was dying. Not soon, the doctor said, but not far off either. A slow settling that would take the winter, and maybe the spring, but probably not the summer. Della drove them home in silence up the frozen ridge road, and neither of them spoke of it, because speaking of it was not the Rourke way. But that night Ada came out to the brooder house again, walking slow, in the men's boots and a wool coat, and she stood in the warm lamplight and watched the birds. And she said, out of a long silence, "He'd have liked to see this." Della said, "I found his ledgers." Ada said, "I know. I put them where you'd find them." And Della turned and looked at her grandmother, who had never in her life made a large production out of anything, and understood that the old woman had known all along, had steered her toward the sale barn and the sick birds in the cedar trunk with the same quiet economy she did everything. And Della's throat closed, and she did not cry because she was Ada's granddaughter. But she reached out and put her hand over the old knotted hand on the wire, and Ada let her, which was as much as Ada ever gave, and it was enough. The second year began the way the first had ended, with a waiting list and a hard cold, and a flock that would not die. But in February something happened that changed the whole county, though no one understood it at first as anything but a rumor. The bird flu came. It came the way it always comes, on the wind and on the boots, and in the migrating flocks, high pathogenic avian influenza, and it moved through the commercial operations of the region like fire through dry grass. Della heard it first from Ruthie at the gas station, who said a big layer operation 2 counties over had lost its whole flock, tens of thousands of birds, gassed and buried by men in white suits. And then she heard it closer, that an outbreak had been confirmed in the northern part of Haldon County itself. And then the state came in and drew the quarantine zones on a map. And the county's poultry world, which had laughed at 800 sick chicks 2 springs before, stopped laughing entirely. Della did what her grandfather's ledgers told her to do, which was written on a page dated 1957 in the small slanted hand, a page she had read a dozen times without knowing it would matter this much. When the sickness is on the wind, close the flock, let no bird in and no boot in, and do not disturb them until it passes. She shut the gate at the bottom of the ridge road. She stopped the porch sales, which broke her customers' hearts and her own, and she told them all the same thing. We'll be back when it's safe, and she meant it. She would not let a single vehicle up the ridge, would not let a single boot near the pens that had not been on her own feet, and she moved the birds to the pasture farthest from the road and the far ridge, and she watched them every morning with a dread she had not felt since the first week of losses, waiting for the wheeze, waiting for the crusted eyes, waiting for the sudden deaths that were the signature of the thing. They did not come. Around the county they came everywhere else. Through February and into March, the flu emptied coop after coop after coop. It took the small backyard flocks that had bought their pretty birds at the sale barn, and it took the mid-sized operations, and in the second week of March it reached the north end and got into Cal Werner's houses. And Cal Werner, who ran the biggest broiler operation in the county, watched men in white suits gas and bury more than 40,000 birds over the course of 4 days. Everything he had, the whole flock, the whole year, the whole strain he'd built his name on, dead in the ground at the edge of a field. The papers called it the worst outbreak the region had seen in a generation. By the end of March, there was hardly a live chicken left in Halden County. Hardly one. There was Della Rourke's flock, 580-some birds on the far pasture up the ridge, untouched, unsick, alive. She did not understand at first why hers had been spared, and she was too careful a person to believe it was luck. She kept the gate shut a full month past the last confirmed case in the county, and she read her grandfather's ledgers again by lamplight, and she found at last the thing that explained it, on a page from 1966. There had been a flu then, too, a bad one, and Emmett had written plainly, "The birds bred for survival carry more than toughness against the common sickness. They carry a wider strength. I lost 40 of the herd to it and no more. Reed across the road lost every bird he had. His were bought birds. Mine were made birds. It cannot be bought and it cannot be rushed, and no one will believe it until they have seen it with their own eyes." Della sat with that page for a long time. It was not certainty, and she knew it was not certainty, and she never once claimed to anyone that her birds were immune to a thing that had no cure. But she understood that a flock bred for 40 years to be hardy, kept on grass in the open air the old way, instead of crowded in the humid dark of a commercial house where disease moved like wildfire, closed tight the moment the wind turned bad, was a flock built to survive exactly the kind of storm that had just leveled the county, and that her grandfather had known this, and had written it down, and had waited in the cedar trunk to be proven right one more time. When the quarantine lifted and the county began, slowly, to count what it had lost and what it would take to rebuild, a strange thing happened. The county had no chickens and no eggs and no hens to lay them, and the hatcheries that supplied the whole region were themselves shut down or backed up for months, and the price of a laying hen went from a few dollars to more than anyone had ever paid, and there was, in the whole of Halden County, exactly one flock of proven, healthy, hardy laying hens that had come through the flu alive. It was hers. The thing that had made those 800 chicks worthless at the sale barn, the sickness, was the same thing that had bred the strain that survived the flu, and now the survival that had made her a laughingstock made her, quietly and without her seeking it, the most important poultry keeper in the county. They came up the ridge road as soon as she opened the gate, not for eggs this time, though they wanted those too. They came for the birds themselves, for hatching eggs, for the blood, for the chance to rebuild their flocks with stock that had proven it could live through the thing that had killed everything they'd had. Della sold hatching eggs at first, and then she set up an incubator in the brooder house, the way her grandfather had, and she began to hatch chicks from her own flock and sell them. And she was careful, she was so careful, to select the way Emmett had written to select, to breed only from the strongest and the hardiest, to refuse the temptation to hatch every egg for the quick money, and instead protect the strain that was worth more than any quick money could ever be. She wrote it all down. The 7th ledger filled, and she started the 8th. It was in April of that second year that Cal Werner drove up the ridge road. He came alone in his big clean truck, and he parked at the bottom by the closed part of the drive and walked up the rest of the way on foot the way you do when you understand that the gate matters. And Della saw him coming from the brooder house and did not go to meet him, only kept working and let him come to her. He stood for a while at the edge of the pasture and watched her birds scratch and forage in the spring grass, hundreds of them, alive. And he did not say anything for a long time, and Della let the silence sit the way Ada would have let it sit. Then Cal Werner, who had told her 2 springs before that she'd bought 800 funerals, who had predicted her failure twice as a fact offered for consideration, took off his cap and turned it in his hands and said, "I lost all of them. 41,000 birds, everything." And Della said, "I heard. I'm sorry." And she meant it because she was not a person who took pleasure in another's ruin. And he heard that she meant it, and something went out of him, some last resistance, and he said, "Quiet. I came to ask if you'd sell me hatching eggs from your stock." He said, "I came to ask you to teach me how you kept them alive." He did not make a large production out of it. He did not apologize in words exactly, because men like Cal Werner rarely find the words, but the walking up the ridge on foot with his cap in his hands was the apology, and Della understood it as one, and she accepted it the way it was offered. She said, "I'll sell you hatching eggs." And then she said the thing that mattered more, the thing her grandfather would have said. She said, "But it won't work the fast way. It took him 40 years. She said, "You can't buy it and you can't rush it. You breed the ones that survive, and you cull the rest, and you keep them the old way, and you write everything down, and in 40 years you've got a flock that lives through the thing that kills everybody else's. That's the whole secret. There isn't another one." Cal Werner stood there and took that in, this man who had built the biggest operation in the county on speed and scale and doing everything the fast way. And he nodded slowly and he said, "My father kept birds like that when I was a boy. I remember them. I thought he was behind the times." And Della said, "So did everybody about my grandfather." And the two of them stood there in the April light looking at the living flock, two people from two families that had made the same mistake and the same recovery a generation apart. And there was nothing more to say, so they said nothing, and it was enough. Ada died in June, the way the doctor had said she would, in the back bedroom that smelled of cedar and liniment, with Della beside her. She went quiet and without a production, the way she had done everything, and her last clear words, spoken 2 days before at the window, while she watched the cars come up the ridge road for eggs and chicks, had been, "He was right." And Della had said, "I know, Grandma." And Ada had said, "No." She looked at Della. "You were right, too." And that was the only praise the old woman had ever given her outright, and Della carried it for the rest of her life. They buried Ada on the ridge next to Emmett, in the small family plot inside the leaning fence, on a green day in June, with the flock scratching in the pasture below, and Sophia and Ruthie and Dwight, and standing a little apart with his cap in his hands, Cal Werner among the few who came. Della did not cry at the grave because she was Ada's granddaughter, but she cried that night alone in the brooder house among the warm lamps and the peeping of a new hatch, and she let herself, that once, because there was no one to see her hold the line, and holding it alone had stopped being necessary. The years turned on the ridge the way they turn, in seasons and hatches and the slow filling of ledgers. Della's operation grew, but it grew the only way she trusted, the way everything else had happened, by patience and not by debt, by letting the demand pull it forward instead of pushing it with money she did not have. She never took a loan, she never advertised. She added a second pasture and a second brooder house the 4th year, built with cash from the year before, when the demand had grown past what she could meet. And she added them the same way she had done everything, slow, careful, one board at a time, refusing to become the thing her grandfather had warned against, refusing to breed for the eye or the crate or the fastest weight, refusing to trade the strain's hard-won survival for a faster dollar. The Rourke Ridge name, which the old feed store men had said with a small nod when they realized whose granddaughter she was, became a name that people 3 counties over said the way you say the name of something that has proven itself, and there was a waiting list every spring for the chicks. And Cal Werner rebuilt his operation on her stock and kept his own ledgers now, in a small hand. And the two of them would stand at the edge of a pasture sometimes in the evening light and say very little, which was its own kind of friendship. 4 years after the morning of the auction, on a March day much like the one she had first driven up the ridge, with 800 wheezing reasons to be laughed at, Della drove down to the sale barn again. She had not been back since. She went because she'd heard there was a lot of sick birds nobody would touch, a rejected order, marked down to almost nothing, wheezing in a stack of flats in the corner, while the county's buyers slowed to look and then sped up so they would not be caught looking. She stood at the back in her grandmother's canvas coat, which she wore now without a shred of self-consciousness because she had earned the right, with the 8th ledger rolled up in one fist, and she watched the men file past the sick chicks and laugh, because in Halden County, a laugh was still cheaper than a bid. And when the auctioneer got to them and said, "Folks, we got these respiratory birds, open and bid whatever you got in your pocket," Della Rourke raised her hand and said, $40. The barn did not go quiet this time. This time a man near the front, a young one, new to the county, turned to the fellow beside him and asked who that was. And the fellow, an older man who had been there 4 years before, said, "Lo," with something like reverence, "that's the Rourke girl. She's the one who kept her whole flock alive through the flu when everybody else lost theirs. Buy sick birds, does she?" the young one said, half laughing, and the older man did not laugh. He said, "Those are the ones she wants." He said it the way Ada had said it, as if confirming a suspicion held for years. He said, "Sick birds that live are the only birds worth having, and she's about the only one left who knows it." And Della carried the 800 flats out to a truck, a newer one now, though she'd kept the old 1988 Ford.